Welcome back to another edition of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David KRAYDEN, and it's a real pleasure today to have a very special guest with me, and that's Neil Oliver, who I'm sure you all know, as you always tell me, and we'll be back in just a moment to talk about a variety of issues.
So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist.
Yes, please like the broadcast, as Sasha, my cat, always reminded you, and we still have her up there. And thank you again for all the folks who've been letting forth with your condolences. I really appreciate it. But Neil, it's so nice to have you here. I watch your show regularly, and you've had me on twice on your GBN broadcast. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to be able to talk about Canadian issues to a larger audience. But I wanted to get going with your book, and I have it here, if I can get it, yes. Hauntings, a book of ghosts and where to find them. I have to confess, I have read dozens of ghost books over the years. I love them. Every time I travel someplace, I'll pick up a local copy of Where to Find the Ghosts in this neighborhood, in this state, this province, or if I'm out of the country, that country. But I have never read a more literate ghost book than this one. And it's difficult to put down, not just because I find the history so fascinating, not to mention the ghost stories, but the fact that you make comments, philosophical comments about why we're interested in ghosts, why we're interested in the paranormal, why we're interested in the hereafter, that I just found absolutely fascinating. And I just wanted to know, because I know you visit a lot of battlefields in this book, and you discuss the obvious link between battlefields and ghost sightings. And I'm wondering, did your experience with Two Men in a Trench that aired on BBC Two have that lasting effect upon you in terms of going to battlefields and feeling the effect of the carnage there?
It's certainly how it started, David. I suppose all of my life, like you just expressed there, I've always been I've always been very open-minded when I hear people describe an encounter with some kind of inexplicable phenomenon. I always allow that the person is telling the God's honest truth. That is what they experienced. And whether it was a trick of the light or they were mistaken is neither here nor there. It's their sincerity that always gets through to me, and I've always just been open-minded about the thought that they are genuinely experiencing something that sits out with the normal spectrum of that which we can identify and explain using our senses and using the science that we have. When it came to Two Men in a Trench, obviously that was all focused around battlefields. We visited and surveyed and excavated and metal detected a dozen battlefields during the course of 2 runs of that series. And inevitably, you encounter people on those battlefields who will take you aside and say, a really weird thing happened to me here a few years ago, and so on and so on. And it becomes a recurrent theme. And there's no way that all of those people are lying. They're not all, they haven't all just come to make something up. Maybe some of them do. You'd have to allow a percentage of that. But it's sincerity that comes through. Very often the kind of people that tell you this, they're not the sort of people you would expect to come at you with a ghost story. Nice, sober, serious people, academics sometimes, all sorts of people. And I suppose in answer to your question, I came away from that experience thinking that it seemed to make sense that in places where for a few minutes or an hour there was terrible shared stress, suffering, dying and death, shared by hundreds, if not thousands of people in the same relatively brief space of time, that it might leave a residue, that a landscape might be left affected by all of the residue of those emotions. You know, like cigar smoke after somebody's walked out of a room, or perfume after somebody has, you know, has moved on from a space, but you walk in and you still encounter that scent. And it seems to me to make sense. There are serious scientists who contemplate the notion of the residue of emotion, that a deeply something intense experienced by one person, perhaps, or something shared by many people. You know, you get into things like legends like the Angel of Mons, and there have been other moments where many people in the same space have felt and said and testified that they all experienced something similar. And I just, there's a book that I've had since I was a teenager that my mum gave me. It's called A Sense of Something Strange, and it's by Archie Roy, who he's a scientist. He was an astronomer. He helped NASA come up with the orbit patterns for the Apollo lunar landings.
Yeah.
So he's a serious scientist, but he also held the chair of parapsychology at Glasgow University for the last decade and more of his life. And that form of words, you know, he said that all of his investigations into the paranormal, or whatever word you want to use to describe those phenomena, he said had left him with a sense of something strange. And I think that's a legitimate conclusion to draw. I too have spent enough time in enough places, and I've had testimony from enough people that I too am left with a sense of something strange.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a Civil War reenactor. I haven't done it in years, largely because of the COVID pandemic. It was impossible to do this sort of thing for years, and because of there's been an explosion of anti-Civil War hysteria in the United States. But I used to go down quite a bit. And there's a virtual ghost tour industry in that city. It's incredible. You go there and you can't walk from your bed and breakfast or hotel onto the street without being accosted by a ghost story storyteller or a ghost tour storyteller. And of course, Gettysburg is always said to be the most haunted place in America because of the battlefield. And I used to wonder, because I'd say, yeah, it was catastrophic what happened in Gettysburg in terms of the casualties and the battle deaths. But that's nothing compared to some of the battlefields in Europe. I mean, and not just on the Western Front in the First World War. But I'm particularly fascinated with the carnage that occurred on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. You think of the millions of people who died in Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk over three days. Just phenomenal. And I'm wondering, we never heard the same sort of ghost stories from that part of the world. But I'm wondering if that's just because we never listened and we haven't investigated that. And I'm sure there's so much more in terms of the paranormal and in terms of these ghost stories that will come out of Russia if we listen and if they have a chance to tell us those stories.
I think so. I think part of what happened, or what, and it's still the case that, you know, since the middle years of the 17th century, Francis Bacon and the advent of the scientific method and so on. So we've had centuries dominated by science, and obviously in the last few years we all learned to fear the science in relation to recent events. But it elbowed out of the picture everything else. Every other kind of everything had to be a scientific explanation for everything, and that which science could not address, it simply ignored. You know, yes. Science can't really answer the question why. It's really good on what and how and where and when, and so, but why we're here, you know, those kinds of speculative questions that haunt us as human beings are not really very well addressed by science. And when you get into by the time of the 20th century, and you're talking there about the Second World War, and you're also talking about a culture that by the 1940s had been overtaken by communism and Stalinism, which was in many ways an unromantic, hyper-pragmatic approach to economics and, you know, and the value of human life. And I don't think it left much space for people to entertain, far less to articulate those thoughts. And I think it's part of why people are very often reluctant in our culture as well to talk about experiences that they sometimes have, because they know that they'll almost certainly be ridiculed. If you say you've seen a ghost or you had some kind of inexplicable experience, people will tend to say, you were drunk, or if you had a bump on the head. Because of the advent of the scientific method 300 and odd years ago, we don't, in the modern era, we don't even have the vocabulary and the grammar and the terminologies with which to articulate these experiences. We're left having to talk about things like ghosts, because it's a word left over from another time. And I think like Archie Roy did, that there are explanations out there for the phenomena that people experience. We know, sitting where you are now and where I'm sitting, that the air around us is filled with radio frequencies that are undetectable to us as human beings. But if you turned on a radio, it would suddenly translate those wavelengths into something that you could hear. So we know that we're surrounded by the invisible. And I think likewise there are phenomena that people, for whatever reason, just catch glimpses of, sometimes in certain places under certain circumstances, and maybe determined to some extent by what's going on in their subconscious or their unconscious. And they brush past some, a catch, just momentary, they intercept a signal and then it's gone. And that these thoughts are always just dismissed. So, when you talk about, whatever people experienced at Kursk, the Battle of Borodino always appalls me. That was in 1812 during the Napoleonic era. And the death toll at Borodino was equivalent, someone worked out in the modern era, to a fully laden jumbo jet crashing every 5 minutes from dawn till dusk.
Wow. It's
unthinkable. It's unthinkable. And so you imagine the residue of emotion in a place like that. Why wouldn't there be? Why shouldn't there be some echo of all of that experience that in some way some people might from time to time catch a glimpse of? And I feel there are conversations to be had. I hope the book is more than a litany of ghost stories. I've tried to broaden out the conversation, because I absolutely feel that this is part of the human experience that just in the last few hundred years we have stopped being willing to articulate and to share with one another. And it should just be an acknowledged part of the human experience.
Yeah. Oh, no, you've certainly gone beyond telling ghost stories. I would say most of the book is his history and your discussion of how that history impacts us today. I found chapter 4 to be especially touching. I'm a student of the Great War. I find the Great War to be eminently fascinating for so many reasons. I think it was one of the huge tragedies of history, and I think one of the most useless wars ever fought. But I found your chapter 4 to be extremely interesting because you discuss how Rupert Brooke and others imagined these epic battles that they were going to be in as cleansing, and the naivete to think that they were going to be in this industrial war that was going to create more carnage on the battlefield than had ever occurred before, with the machine gun and the artillery. And they talked about it being a cleansing experience instead of the carnage that was yet to come. This might serve as a bit of a transition to current events, but it occurred to me as I read that aren't we thinking the same way today when we have a general from the British Army advocating national service, conscription, so that we can be better prepared to fight Russia?
Yes.
I was in the military for 12 years, and I lived through the Cold War as you did. We're basically contemporaries in age. And I remember we used to say that the worst thing that could happen would be to ignite a nuclear war with Russia. that we did everything possible to avoid that. Deterrence was not about fighting the Russians. It was about avoiding a nuclear war, anything to avoid a nuclear war, because that would be the end of history, the end of mankind. And yet we're talking about that now. We're pushing on Russia through Ukraine, through NATO, and we're musing about the possibility of having a war with Russia. And is it acceptable? Are we exercising the same degree of naivete and almost stupidity that we saw in 1914?
I don't know that is it naivety. Obviously, the generation, the Edwardian men and boys who found themselves, especially those like Rupert Brooke, who were classically educated, and they had read all their Greek legends and their Greek mythology, and they had they had these ideas about the warrior creed and and the nobility of the hero and all of the rest of it, and it was all muddled in their heads, and they had no concept of what industrialized warfare was going to look like and the consequences that it would have. So I think they were genuinely naive. But I cannot at the moment rule out the possibility that amongst those in charge are people who they have a hold on power and a hold on wealth. We've seen this, unprecedented transfer of wealth in the last few years from middle class, if you like, to the rich, and we've seen them take control. There's a group who have sought and obtained control over our lives. And I do think they're some of them are of a mentality that would rather bring the whole temple down on all of our heads than surrender that control. Which that's hard for someone like you and me. We can't. You think no, you'd compromise before you did that, because ultimately you would want everyone to be left with a life. But I think we are dangerously in thrall to people who would actually prefer apocalypse or Armageddon to rather than surrendering so much as a scintilla of what they have drawn unto themselves. We're not necessarily dealing with people who think like you and me and who value the sanctity of each human life. I also think that in terms of that pronouncement that was made by Colonel Sanders, General Sanders, I can't remember his rank, and he, suggesting this citizen army. I don't know the extent to which that might just have been a part of the kind of nudge unit psyop that has been deployed over the last few years just to keep everyone on edge. Because we've been nudged from one thing to the next, the so-called pandemic, and then war in Ukraine, and then climate crisis, earth at boiling point, 15-minute cities, CBDCs, financial collapse, cyber attack. It's been just this deluge of things to be anxious about. And if you want to get more, if there are any people that had been missed by that psyop, going after their children, that's guaranteed to put people on the edge of their seat. You say, right, we're going to come and take your teenage boys and put them in uniform and march them away. Because it does, there is no way in which you could contemplate a citizen army fighting Russia. It's not going to happen. If they were put on the trains, if they were taken across to mainland Europe, our citizen army, and put on trains and sent towards whatever frontier, if Russia was made to accept that it was now at war with Britain and everyone else, the nuclear alternative would be triggered, and that citizen army would be vaporized along with the railway network, before they even got anywhere. They're never going to come to grips with the Russian front line. A war is not going to be fought in that way. We know that. And the harvesting of souls that's going on in Ukraine, if that isn't enough to remind people of the potential of the meat grinder, then I don't know what is. What are we looking at now? At least 500,000 Ukrainian dead. And in the front lines now, they've got pregnant women and men our age and older dragooned into the ranks. It's absolutely beyond description. And I don't know that. I think it's wickedness rather than naivety.
Yeah, you've noted yourself about what happened to the Citizens Army in 1916 when it was sent over to France and Belgium, and it was annihilated in the Battle of the Somme 19,000 dead on the first day.
Mhm.
And once again, we're going to send a British expeditionary force to fight Russia. And this was a full general, the Sanders, who made this remark,
Yeah,
the
and
commander of the British Army.
you'll know
And
perhaps like no one else would about what happened to the Newfoundland regiment that came across.
yes, yes,
Tiny,
totally annihilated.
numerically tiny Newfoundland, and they raised 1,500, 1,800 men and sent them. And by the end of their first thing, Beaumont Hamel or wherever, they were almost all gone, all at
Mhm.
once. All of that investment of love and life in those 1,800 souls, all spent for nothing in minutes. And that
Yes.
was 100 years ago. There was almost an excuse for it 100 odd years ago because the potential of industrialized war had not been witnessed. But we know now what we're capable of doing. Anyone that would march a citizen army into that machinery this time is wicked. It's not naivety.
I can almost see them trying this Pals Battalion stuff again too, even though that as you pointed out, that served to just wipe out entire communities. But you watch them try that again too, because they don't seem to understand the lunacy of their own words and actions, and it astounds me because I'm hearing the same thing, of
I
course,
maintain that
here.
the people that call for it, they should go. I think if you vote for it in the House of Commons, it's you and your sons. You can go to the war first. Let's see how you get on. These
Yeah.
Tobias Elwood and the rest of them that are in Parliament that are calling for it. Go, and if you put your money where your mouth is, if you want to fight face to face, hand to hand, go and do it, and we will see how you get on.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best advice. Now, I wanted to play a clip here from one of your recent broadcasts where you're talking about the World Economic Forum, and that's a favorite subject of mine and my viewers and the people I write for at the Post Millennial. And you spoke of the three-pronged attack, and I thought this was absolutely brilliant. That the WEF, you spoke of money, energy, and food being the three-pronged attack. And I just want to play that brief clip for us now.
There's a digital cage. I'm also among those profoundly alarmed by the increasingly blatant way in which those same delusional kakistocracy being an early 19th century word for government by the worst elements in society, those kakistocrats have manoeuvred to seize control of the very stuff of life. The Trinity, being money, energy, and most importantly of all, food. The imminent central bank digital currencies are about the control of money. The continual wars with Russia, war in the Middle East, are at least in part about the control of energy. And the war on farmers and farming, well, in the form of the suicidal policies regarding the pursuit of net zero, is about control by the few of the food supply of the many.
I think this is absolutely brilliant here, what you've said, and I find it fascinating, and especially when you mention the food. But you've mentioned a word here that I have spent most of my adult life immersed in politics to some degree. Kakistocracy. I had never run across that word in political science or elsewhere, but I find it absolutely fascinating because we are facing a kakistocracy. These are eminently evil people, ill-served to lead anybody, even a brigade, to the men's room. And I cannot believe that so many people are just watching their freedom vanish and evaporate while these people in Davos sit around tables patting themselves on the back for all the hard work they're doing. Meanwhile, they're whining and dining. They're flying in on their private jets. They're living the life of luxury. And they're saying, you people, you poor huddled masses out there, it's up to you to make the sacrifice for climate change and all these other key things. So I think you've hit the nail on the head here.
I accept climate change because that's what climate does. Climate's been changing for thousands. It's a mutable, volatile system. Climate crisis, nonsense. That's the biggest hoax that's been foisted upon the human species to date, I think, perhaps. So I simply don't buy it. And I think it's just more of what I mentioned before about that kind of nudge unit psyops mentality of trying to keep people on edge. And we are being led by the worst of people, without a doubt. And I think what is actually being maneuvered towards is feudalism. And I know I'm not alone in thinking it and saying it. You know, Whitney Webb, who I admire hugely, uses some of the same terminology when she speaks about what the direction of travel. It's feudalism, and it's worth remembering from a historical perspective that something like feudalism is how most people have lived for almost all of the time that we put under the bracket of civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's described in different ways, but it works out in the same way that you have a tiny, tiny number of people, the king, some favoured knights around him, and they have everything. And the serf class scrabble for crumbs, beneath the table that they're sitting around. That's been the normal run of things for almost everyone for 5,000 years. And for reasons that we still try to unpick and understand, for a few hundred years in the West, in Britain, in North America, a handful of other places besides, people were allowed up, and you got equality before the law. You got the sanctity of the individual. You got habeas corpus. You got universal suffrage. You got equality for men and women. You got all of these things, and it's so unusual in the story of humankind for a large part of any population to live with that kind of peace, that kind of aspiration, that kind of security. And what has happened is enough generations have had the chance to take it for granted that now most people, or too many people alive today, think that a world structured as it is in the West is in the natural order of things. Mm-hmm. And it's unbelievably unlikely that you would get the chance to live the kind of lives that have been possible in our part of the world for just a couple of hundred years. Not even that. It's an incredibly brief blink of time. And what is happening right before our eyes is we're being maneuvered back towards a feudal state, where a group, this time the kakistocrats of the World Economic Forum and whoever else, a handful of people with all the money, all the energy, and control of all the food, will tell 8 billion serfs how it's going to be. That's where we're headed, unless enough people recognise that that is the direction of travel and simply exercise the power of no. Just the power of standing up and saying, no, that is not happening.
Well, in Canada, we're going through a food crisis, artificially created food crisis, not unlike that created by Joseph Stalin in parts of the Soviet Union and Ukraine in the 1930s, where he created an artificial famine. Because of this existential threat, this so-called existential threat of climate change. And I agree with you. Of course, there's climate change. There's always been climate change, but it is not something that's going to bring the imminent end of the world, as far as I'm concerned. But farmers in Canada have been asked to stop using fertilizer, to cut fertilizer use by 30% by 2030. Now, most people would scratch their head and say, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Seems to me that we won't be able to produce as much food. And that's exactly the point. They don't want to produce as much food. We can always eat the insects. We can stop eating meat. My God, we won't even have the vegetables after they're through with us. But it amazes me that this is naked aggression on behalf of citizens. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in your country. It's happening throughout Europe. It's happening in Australia. Happening in the United States. And it amazes me that this is all happening simultaneously. They've all got the same policy agenda. You'd think that maybe there was a globalist agenda here.
Yeah, they all
But
use, for years now we've been listening to them trot out this. There's those wonderful montage effects that you see on social media where you have like 50 different news anchors standing by their screen of video screens, and they're all using terminology simultaneously, like "build back better" and a narrow window of opportunity, all of the rest of it. And we're supposed to swallow the idea that all over the world leaders in independent countries are coming to the same conclusions and expressing those conclusions with exactly the same language, all at the same time. And yet, if you voice a fear of globalism, it's to bring down upon yourself all the opprobrium of, anti-Semitism and anti-this and anti-that. And the real anti that's out there at the moment is anti-human. There is undoubtedly an anti-human agenda out there. Bill Gates and the rest of them speak openly about that there ought to be fewer people alive on the planet.
Mhm.
The late Prince
Mhm.
Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, said he'd like to come back as a deadly virus. If he could be reincarnated in the next life, he'd come back as a deadly to help deal with the overpopulation of the planet. And there are
Right.
all of these people that have articulated this thought that there are too many of us, and which begs the question: who's for the chop? Who is the carbon that you want to reduce? Because we're all carbon. Who are you going to get rid of? And the only reason that there are 8 billion people alive on the planet today being fed is because of nitrogen fertilizer. At the moment, we don't have any way. Maybe there are other ways of doing it, but at the moment, we don't have any other way of ensuring food for 8 billion people unless we use these nitrogen fertilizers. And these nitrogen fertilizers, the plan is to take them away entirely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's murderous. That inevitably that means that as many as half of the population alive today, 4 billion people, have to die to make real the absence, to make possible the absence of these kinds of farming technologies that have been developed over the years. Now, you can make all sorts of arguments about the rights and wrongs of using nitrogen fertilizer, but to say that you're going to take them away and that you're going to put this percentage of arable land out of operation, whatever, do something else with it, leave it fallow, build mega cities on it, who knows what, and that they're going to stop farmers farming. There is no way. Occam's razor says you can. The simplest way to interpret that is the intent is there to be fewer people. That's a murderous anti-human agenda. And people are standing by while this happens. I watch youngsters being interviewed in the street as they put polls out, and youngsters saying things like, if farming's bad for the environment, we should stop.
Stop
so the level of brainwashing and misinformation that has been, with which our children, the generations coming through, have been indoctrinated is breathtaking. There are generations out there that think that you can live somehow without farmers. How can that be? You need a politician once every 4 years at an election. You need a doctor 2 or 3 times a year if you get unwell, but you need a farmer 3 times a day, every day for your entire life.
Yes. Now you were always well known. You're no stranger to broadcasting. You're no stranger to television. You've been doing a lot of work on television and for decades now. And you were well known as an archaeologist, historian who brought this to the masses, who brought this information through the popular media. But in the last couple of years, you've gone from being archaeologist, historian Neil Oliver to a political pundit. I hesitate to use that word, but somebody who is speaking about current events and politics in a way that is so visceral and that is so real to people that you have really energized a lot of people who listen to you and watch you. What was the COVID-19 pandemic responsible for that metamorphosis in terms of your public persona, who you are, what you're talking about? I understand the lockdowns did not serve you well at all, as they did any of us. But was that the main impetus for speaking out more politically today?
Yes, I had always really almost proudly classed myself as apolitical. I'd never been moved by a political party. I've never been a member of a political party. When it came to elections, local and national general elections, I've voted for all sorts of people over the years. Sometimes I didn't vote at all because I didn't see that the choice available to me was going to make any difference. And I'm embarrassed when I look back now at my apathy and the way in which I abdicated responsibility for what was happening around me. I take responsibility for that. And I know that I was just generally distracted by my own stuff. I was focused on the work I was doing. I was interested in the things in which I was interested, and I was leaving the running of the world to other people. In the naive, you mentioned naivety earlier in relation to Rupert Brooke, but my naivety was that I thought that whether it was a red government or a blue government or a yellow government, ultimately they pretty much had the people's best interests at heart. Now, I don't think that anymore. I know that the contrary is nearer the mark. But yes, it was when we went into this thing where they sent everyone home to their houses to be locked down. My wife, I'm self-employed. I've been mostly self-employed all my working life, and my wife and I looked at one another and thought, we can't sustain this. If I can't get out and do my stuff. I was doing theatre tours for a while. I was taking sort of a one-man show about a book, actually, and I had been around many theatres and up and down the country. Now, the theatres all closed, obviously, because of lockdown. All sorts of revenue streams for me, like they were for millions of people. I'm not in a special case, but it was very practical for me. I thought, right, how long are you locking down? Because, this is a ticking clock for me. I'm going to lose my house if this goes on beyond a certain point. So I became energized about it. And I thought at the same time, well, this is madness. There's a lot of madness around here. The things like, the whole tearing down of statues, the whole in the around the sort of Black Lives Matter thing, where statues were being torn down, places were being renamed. Everyone was talking about British history as having been nothing but a litany of shameful slavery and colonialism and all of the rest of it. And then we were locked in our homes, and then they started, pushing an experimental medical product into everyone. And I thought, surely it's the silverbacks of the political and media worlds are going to step forward at some point. The people that had an audience, that had gravitas, that had been out there talking the talk for decades. I thought they'll come forward and say that this is wrong, that there are problems here, questions to be asked, and they didn't. There was a deafening silence from everyone, all the people that I might previously have maybe not necessarily respected, but expected to do something in a time of extremis. Nothing, tumbleweed. And so bizarre, a talk radio station in the UK, one of the presenters approached me because I had been writing in a newspaper column questioning some of what was going on. He said, do you want to come on and talk weekly, every Wednesday morning, as it turned out, for half an hour? We'll chew the fat, we'll talk about the affairs of the day. And I said, yeah, sure, fine, that sounds interesting. That garnered a bit of an audience. And then when GB News was being a fledgling project, I was approached by the people building GB News, and I became part of the first cohort of presenters on GB News, and I've been there ever since. But if the audience are surprised to find an ex-archaeology, history, BBC TV presenter now doing what I'm doing, asking the questions that I'm asking and pontificating about the state of the nation, if the audience is surprised, it's as nothing compared to how surprised I am. I just felt that, well, if nobody else is going to say this, if no one else is going to say these things, I'll just have to do it, even if it's incongruous and borderline inappropriate for me to do so. And now years have passed of me doing this, and I have found myself with a different I have adopted a different role, and it's just the way it is. I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't unsay a single thing. I wouldn't undo it. I've lost a lot of people. I used to be patron of this and fellow of that. I used to have an agent. I used to have a Sunday newspaper column. Everyone dropped me. I lost all of my associations with everything, and I thought, but into that void were pulled a whole new cast of characters. Yourself, as you said, I've had you as a guest. I became aware of you online and thought, oh, look, there's a sensible voice. There's a voice. There's a voice I can listen to. He thinks like I do. And so as a lot of people, pulled away from me and cut me adrift and wrote me off, another group of people have become very close to and listening to and talking to, and have been reassured. And I think this is where I'm supposed to be at the moment. And these are the conversations that I should be taking part in. But yes, I was not a politically active. I never protested. I never marched. I never carried a placard. I didn't do that. But then the day came, whatever it is, 4 years ago now, and I thought, you're not having that. That's wrong. And if no one else is going to say that's wrong, I'll just have to say it.
Well, I think COVID-19, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the mandates, they were transformational for so many people, including myself. I would have called myself a very comfortable small C conservative with opinions on most things, but largely trusting, as you said, that the government was probably looking out for our best interest. That all changed for me during COVID, and especially if I could put it into a particular timeline, it was almost precisely, in fact, it was precisely 2 years ago when I was reporting on the Freedom Convoy here in Ottawa. And I was out there it's actually quite reasonable temperature-wise today. But 2 years ago, we were going through about minus 25 centigrade temperatures. It was cold. I was out there every day interviewing people, talking to these truckers and their supporters, and saying, why isn't this message getting through to the CBC, and the CTV, and Global News, and the Toronto Sun, and the Ottawa Citizen, and so on and so on. And I realized that there was a self-censorship going on, and that the government had a very sinister agenda. From day one, these people were being labeled as racist and misogynist. I saw no evidence of that anywhere. And worse, they were being called Nazis because supposedly somebody had a Nazi flag on the first day, which has never been authenticated. But as I was trying to explain the last time I was on your show, all of this supposed intelligence about the Freedom Convoy being somehow involved with white supremacy or nationalism or far right causes was all manufactured by a bogus group on the internet. And the Trudeau government ate it up. And not only that, they not only ate it up and said, hey, these people are all white supremacists and Nazis. They shared that with the Five Eyes. They shared that intelligence with the Five, and it sort of had a circular life of its own. So journalists would go to other countries in the Five Eyes and say, did you have this information confirmed that the Freedom Convoy people were white supremacists or belonged to a militia? And it's yes, we have that information. Of course, it was all bogus. And I think I realized at that time that the government wasn't on my side, no matter what the color of that government was in Canada. And they were working towards a globalist agenda. And all I had to do was call up the WEF internet site, and they were talking about the very things that were supposedly conspiracy theories. And I realized that there was a battle for the hearts and minds of Canadians and Europeans and Australians and Britons. All of the traditionally democratic countries were under attack by this agenda, and it was transformational for me. And and for instance, you talk about finding other people who you suddenly agree with. I've become quite friendly with Naomi Wolf, who was somebody I would never in a previous life really had much in common with.
Yeah.
But because of the pandemic, and because both of us have realized the most important things are freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the basic freedom to speak our own minds, that those things are suddenly more important than anything else. Those are the issues that matter. Well, that's the end of part one of this phenomenal and very interesting interview with Neil Oliver. And I want you to tune in again tomorrow as we go into part 2, because it just gets better. This has been one of the most interesting interviews I've conducted in a long time, and it's the longest I've ever done for Stand on Guard. But I think you'll enjoy the rest of it just as much as you've enjoyed watching it thus far. And I think it's been time well spent, as a network used to say. We'll see you again tomorrow.
It's that we used to live in a world of left and right, broadly speaking. That's gone. I think we now live in a world of truth and lies.
Hi, this is David Crayden from Crayden's Right and Stand on Guard. Join the resistance. Resolve to resist. Become a member of this station. I've been practicing journalism in one form or another for over 30 years. I've worked in print, radio, and television for a lot of prestigious publications and media outlets. I was an Armed Forces Public Affairs officer. I worked in Parliament Hill. I know how Ottawa works, and I know how corrupt federal government can be. But you can play a part in opposing Justin Trudeau's government and Justin Trudeau's plans for Canada. You can become a part of the Crayden's Right resistance. Now, I urge you today, please support this station in any way you can. Ring that bell, subscribe, because that ensures you're at least going to continue to be able to watch these episodes. You'll beat the algorithm. But more importantly, I need your financial support. I hate to ask, but that's what I'm doing. I made a decision to pursue independent media because I believed it was the best possible route for me to take as a journalist and as a concerned citizen of Canada. So you can become a part of that. And at only $5, you can become a part of that on YouTube, on Substack, and with Buy Me a Coffee, a one-time donation. But I need your support. And from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. If you've already done that, if you're already supporting a station, thank you. But if you haven't, make that decision today